This morning, January 25th, we are celebrating the feast of the conversion of St. Paul. And my sermon this morning is based upon the epistle which we heard coming to us from the 9th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. And suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven, and he fell to the earth. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. My dear friends in our Lord Jesus Christ, as I mentioned today, we are celebrating the feast of the conversion of St. Paul. Here in the Acts of the Apostles, and I dare say that very often when we quote from the New Testament, aside from the Gospels obviously, the rest of the New Testament, if you hear a quotation quoted from the New Testament, more than likely than not, it is a quotation coming to us from the Apostle Paul. Obviously, St. Paul was one of the most profound and prolific writers of the New Testament. That being said, here in the 9th chapter, where we heard quoted, and it's basically in its entirety this morning, here in the Acts of the Apostle, here is where we see the beginning of St. Paul's and his ministry, his importance to the young church. Prior to that, though, in essence, we know very little about St. Paul. Basically, there's four main things that we know about Paul. Number one, first of all, before he was named as St. Paul, which was his Latin name, in essence, he was Saul of Tarsus. So that's the first thing that we know. The second thing, of course, that he was a Pharisee. And as a result, he was, as we'll soon find out, very important. Third, as I just mentioned, he was important enough to obtain letters. And as we heard this morning from the 2nd verse of this 9th chapter, and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of the way, whether they be men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. As we will discuss here in a little bit, St. Paul had such importance that he was able to obtain official documentation, official letters, giving him permission, if you will, or the official capacity to go out and bring back people of the way. In other words, Christians, those who were following our blessed Savior. And then finally, as we heard prior to this 9th chapter that we hear mention of today, we hear earlier on, 2 chapters earlier, in fact, in chapter 7 and verse 58, we hear about the stoning of the very first martyr of the church. And of course, we know that as being St. Stephen. St. Paul was there present, and he makes mention of this a few times during the New Testament, but yet specifically in the 7th chapter and the 58th verse of the Acts of the Apostles, we hear the following. And cast him out of the city, St. Stephen, and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the young man's feet, whose name was Saul. Again, Saul was instrumental in the capture, if you will, or going out and gathering together young Christians there in the young church. Because, as I stated, he was a Pharisee, and he was a fervent member of the Pharisee. He wanted to make sure that those who were proclaiming to be a follower of the Messiah our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He wanted to make sure that they were brought in to atone for, in his eyes, their sins of going against the Jewish religion. Here, as we heard in the first verse of today's chapter, the 9th chapter, it's instrumental in showing how zealous and how fervent St. Paul was, or at that time Saul, how he was for bringing about the Jewish faith and the condemnation of those whom he saw as going against that Jewish faith. And as we hear from the first verse, and Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. In essence, as we heard mentioned right now, what I read to you in this first verse shows out how determined that St. Paul was in bringing about the destruction of the young church. As we heard, he was breathing out threatenings and slaughter. Have you ever gotten so mad? Have you ever gotten so angry? Or have you ever seen anyone that's so on edge? They're so angry. They're just breathing. This is what we are hearing St. Paul being described at. He was so angry. He was so livid. He was so intent on destroying the young church that he was breathing out threatenings and slaughter against them. And so this should set the tone, if you will, or it describes perfectly to a T about how St. Paul was. And again, as we mentioned, St. Paul, keep in mind, was such a man of great importance. He was so important that he was able to seek a letter where he would be able to go to Damascus and seek out those and bound them, both men and women, and bring them back to Jerusalem. Keep in mind, as we have mentioned, St. Paul was a Pharisee, and he was seeking this letter that in part would have had to have been approved by the Sanhedrin. And keep in mind the Sanhedrin, who was in charge of the Sanhedrin? Gamaliel. And Gamaliel was the master, if you will, of St. Paul. St. Paul was his disciple. St. Paul was his student. St. Paul was under Gamaliel. And so this letter would have been not only had to have been approved by the high priest, who was Theophilus at the time, but also Gamaliel, who again was in charge of the Sanhedrin. So again, this is pointed out to show the importance of St. Paul. This was a man on a mission. He was a man who was determined to destroy the young church and to do everything in his power to bring that young church down. As we hear further on, though, sometimes in life, and this is true for all of us, but sometimes in life we plan certain things, but things don't go according to plan. Things don't go according to the way in which we would like them to do or like for them to go. Our plans go awry, so to speak. This is certainly what happened on the road to Damascus. Because what happened was a bright light shone around St. Paul, and he fell to the earth. Now, keep in mind, if you look through different portraits or pictures or paintings, so to speak, of this happening to St. Paul, very often artists will portray a horse nearby, meaning, of course, St. Paul fell to the earth from a horse. Nowhere in Scripture does it say that he fell from a horse. It just says that he fell to the earth. But again, this is certainly symbolic, but it also is literal. He fell to the earth. Because what happened next was that, again, as we've pointed out so far, this was a man of great importance. This was a man that was determined in bringing about the destruction of the church. This was a man that was hell-bound, if you will, to bring back Christians bound. And he was breathing out threatenings, as we were told. But yet, this great man of great importance, this man who was so intent on the destruction of the church, he fell to the earth and was blinded. Sometimes in life, and this is true of some of us, I emphasize some of us, because as soon as I try to paint a broad brush and say it's for everybody, somebody invariably raises their hand and says, no. But so some of us need to be brought down to earth because, quite frankly, we get a little bit too big for our britches. You see, we become full of ourselves, like St. Paul was certainly full of himself. It was his view that was important. It was his way that was important. And he was going to make sure that everything went according to the way in which he was going to see things. So is the same with us sometimes. Sometimes we become so full of ourselves in regards to how important that we are. Sometimes we can become full of ourselves because we believe that our way is the only way. We become so full of ourselves because we would rather see things done our way and no other way. But you see, as a Christian, it's not our way that needs to be the way. It's the Lord's way. It's God's way. It's our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ's way. Because he is our Savior. He is the one to whom we give our hearts. He is the one who has made it possible for us to be where we are. Further on, if you look in the same Acts of the Apostles, we hear the whole reason why the things that happened to St. Paul on the road to Damascus, why they happened that way. Because our Lord appeared to Ananias, and as we heard, Ananias was the one who was chosen by our Lord to go seek out Saul and to heal him from his blindness. Keep in mind, St. Paul was blinded during that light. St. Paul was blinded when our Lord appeared to him. St. Paul was blinded and was not able to see. And so Ananias was chosen by our Lord to go out and seek Saul. And this is what our Lord said to Ananias. Go thy way, for he, meaning St. Paul, for he is a chosen vessel unto me, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. You see, St. Paul was a chosen vessel, just like you and I are a chosen vessel. God, in his infinite wisdom, which we don't understand, I certainly don't, but God in his infinite wisdom has chosen you and chosen me to be his vessels. It is up to us to become that vessel. It is up to us to humble ourselves before the Almighty and to do his will. Sometimes we have to fall to earth before we realize that. But if that's what it takes, so be it. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.